Tonight on Nightfall Royals, we journey into the life of George Washington, from his quiet childhood in Virginia to his role as Commander-in-Chief in the Revolutionary War, and finally, to becoming the first President of the United States. Where are you listening from, and what time is it there? I'd love to hear in the comments. It's always fascinating to see where in the world you're joining from. Wishing you a peaceful night, under the same stars that once shone over Washington's America. George Washington entered the world on February 22, 1732, in Westmoreland County, Virginia, though at the time the date was recorded as February 11, 1731-32. Under the old Julian calendar still used in Britain and its colonies, the calendar changed to the Gregorian system in 1752, shifted his birthday to the date by which we now remember it. Such small shifts in record-keeping remind us how human the passage of time truly is. History itself bends quietly under the weight of calendars and conventions, but the life remains. He was born on a plantation known as Pope's Creek, into a family that belonged to the Virginia gentry. His father, Augustine Washington, was a planter and ironworks entrepreneur, a man striving to secure a stable place for his family in the often volatile economic climate of the colonies. His mother, Mary Ball Washington, would outlive most of her peers, remembered for her strength, frugality, and an unyielding seriousness that left a deep imprint on George's character. George was the eldest child of Augustine and Mary, but he was not the eldest of all Augustine's children. From Augustine's first marriage to Jane Butler came Lawrence Augustine Jr. and Jane. After Jane Butler's passing, Augustine married Mary Ball, and together they had George, followed by Betty, Samuel, John Augustine, Charles, and Mildred. The Washington household was thus a large and blended family, full of the dynamics of older and younger siblings, of half-brothers with established paths and younger ones still seeking their place. The world into which George was born was that of tobacco plantations. The crop was both wealth and burden, demanding the work of enslaved Africans and tying the colony's economy to distant markets in Britain. Plantations were not palaces. They were working estates, with barns, fields, and the unending cycles of planting and curing. The Washingtons were not the wealthiest of Virginians, but they were respectable, secure, and connected. Their place was somewhere between struggling middling planters and the very rich elite, like the Carters or Fett. Little is recorded of George's very early childhood, but the geography of his upbringing mattered. Born at Pope's Creek, he would later live at Little Hunting Creek, which would become Mount Vernon, and then at Ferry Farm, near Fredericksburg. Each location placed him close to rivers: the Potomac, the Rappahannock, the creeks and estuaries that fed into the Chesapeake Bay. Waterways shaped Virginia life. They were highways, borders, and providers. For a child, they were also sources of fascination: the tides, the changing currents, the way light shimmered upon the surface. When George was only 11 years old, tragedy struck. His father Augustine died suddenly in 1743. The loss changed the family's course. In colonial Virginia, a father's death often disrupted property, inheritance, and education plans. George's half-brother Lawrence, already a grown man, inherited the prized estate of Mount Vernon. George, as a younger son, received Ferry Farm. Mary Ball Washington became a widow managing land and children. Her strength and sometimes stern nature became all the more apparent. For George, his father's death meant that he would not travel abroad for education in England, as some wealthier Virginia sons did. Instead, his schooling would be local, modest, and practical. George's formal education was limited. He did not attend a university, nor did he travel to Europe as young aristocrats sometimes did. He studied reading, writing, arithmetic, geometry, trigonometry, and basic surveying. He also practiced bookkeeping, learning how to keep orderly records of accounts, a skill that would later serve him well in estate management and military logistics. Though not an intellectual scholar, he was attentive to handwriting, presentation, and the careful arrangement of figures. His surviving notebooks reveal a young man precise in penmanship, conscious of order, and drawn to maxims about behavior. Among these early writings is his famous youthful exercise, The Rules of Civility and Decent Behavior in Company and Conversation. They were not originally his own invention, rather, they were copied from an older English text. But in writing them out by hand, the boy absorbed lessons in restraint, humility, and courtesy. The phrases are quaint to modern ears: "Sleep not when others speak," or "Spit not in the fire," but behind them lay an ethic of self-control, a reminder that dignity begins in small habits. George's relationship with his half-brother Lawrence also shaped him. Lawrence had married into the powerful Fairfax family, one of the most prominent in Virginia, with vast holdings of land. Living part of the time at Mount Vernon with Lawrence exposed George to a world of greater influence. The Fairfaxes, especially Lord Thomas Fairfax, who held extensive northern necklands, would later provide George with his first professional opportunities. Thus, George's earliest years were marked by a blend of modesty and opportunity. A boy without the polish of European schooling, yet one learning self-reliance, order, and the subtleties of social connection. His character was formed not in grandeur but in steady work, family responsibility, and the quiet discipline of observing the world around him. The Virginia of George's childhood was a world balanced between old and new. It was old in its dependence on traditions of landholding, Anglican worship, and ties to Britain. It was new in its sheer physical openness: forests stretching westward, rivers not yet fully charted, mountains distant and alluring. For a boy with eyes to the horizon, it was a landscape not of limits, but of promise. When we reflect on George Washington's beginnings, we see no immediate signs of destiny. He was not the heir of a great fortune, nor the prodigy of a famous school. He was a boy shaped by loss, by work, and by the patience of a widowed mother. His tools were pen, compass, and surveying rod. His lessons were humility, order, and endurance. And these quiet beginnings would prove to be the foundations of a life that later bore extraordinary weight. George Washington's early years unfolded quietly, yet within them lay seeds of discipline and strength that would later define him. After his father's death in 1743, the young boy of 11 found himself living under the steady hand of his widowed mother, Mary Ball Washington. She was known for her stern character, her thrift, and her insistence on upright conduct. Some historians have suggested that George sometimes found her severity burdensome, especially in his teenage years. Yet there is no doubt that her firmness instilled in him the ability to endure hardship, to hold to self-control, and to balance emotion with duty. Life at Ferry Farm near Fredericksburg was not one of ease. It was an ordinary Virginia plantation, dependent on the rhythm of the soil, the weather, and the labor of enslaved workers whose lives were bound in silence to the fortunes of the family. George grew in this setting, surrounded by siblings tasked with practical responsibilities and encouraged to keep order. Unlike wealthier boys who were sent abroad for polished educations, George stayed close to the earth of Virginia, his education modest but practical. His formal schooling never extended beyond what we might call a grammar school level. He studied arithmetic, geometry, basic trigonometry, and surveying, the mathematics of the land. He also practiced bookkeeping, sharpening his ability to record details with clarity and care. What George lacked in scholarly brilliance, he compensated for with diligence and precision. His notebooks survive as evidence: clean lines of handwriting, careful transcriptions of problems, and a youthful effort to master the art of order. One of his most famous exercises during these years was the copying of the rules of civility and decent behavior in company and conversation. Written originally in French in the 16th century and later translated into English, these maxims were a guide to polite conduct. By carefully writing them down, George absorbed lessons in humility, patience, and restraint. While many of the rules were simple: spit not in the fire or sleep not when others speak, It taught a philosophy of self-control and quiet dignity. For a boy who would one day command armies and preside over a republic, the early habit of curbing one's impulses was no small matter. George's half-brother Lawrence Washington played an outsized role in shaping his path. Lawrence, about 14 years older, had served in the British Navy and named his estate Mount Vernon, after Admiral Edward Vernon, under whom he had once served. Lawrence married into the Fairfax family, one of the wealthiest and most influential dynasties in Virginia. This connection would open doors for young George, exposing him to circles of influence and opportunity. Through Lawrence, George became acquainted with Lord Thomas Fairfax, who owned immense tracts of land in the northern neck of Virginia, some 5 million acres stretching toward the Blue Ridge Mountains. Fairfax, an English nobleman who had chosen to settle permanently in Virginia, was impressed by George's seriousness and abilities. At a time when many young men pursued leisure, George displayed a willingness to learn, to work, and to endure. By his mid-teens, George began to learn the art of surveying in earnest with compass, chain, and measuring rod. He entered the forests and meadows of Virginia. Surveying was not a gentleman's pastime but a demanding craft. The surveyor had to pace miles of wilderness, mark boundary lines, and record every rise and river bend with precision. It meant days in the open, enduring rain and insects, and nights by the campfire with only notebooks and instruments as companions. At 17, George Washington received an official appointment as the county surveyor for Culpeper County in 1749. It was a remarkable achievement for someone so young. In this position, he measured plots of land for settlers, recorded deeds, and ensured boundaries were fixed with legal clarity. The work paid well, giving him independence unusual for his age. He earned not only money but the respect of men twice his years, who came to rely on his fairness and exactness. Surveying also taught him to see the land as a whole. He became intimately familiar with Virginia's geography, its rivers, its fertile valleys, its mountain passes. These were not abstract lines on a map, but features he walked, measured, and noted. This deep knowledge of the landscape would later prove invaluable in his military career. To command armies across the frontier required a mind already schooled in terrain. Washington's years as a surveyor gave him just that. By the late 1740s, George Washington was gaining a reputation as a young man of reliability and gravity. People noticed his tall stature. By adulthood, he would stand about 6 feet 2 inches. Unusually tall for the time, and his physical strength. They noted also his composure, his restraint in speech, and his courtesy. He was not yet the symbol of national unity he would one day become, but he was already cultivating a presence that set him apart. There are stories often told about his youth, such as the famous cherry tree tale, in which young George confessed honestly to chopping down his father's tree with the words, "I cannot tell a lie." But historians agree that this story was a fabrication of Parson Mason Weems, who published it after Washington's death to illustrate moral virtue. The true Washington's boyhood virtues were quieter and less dramatic. He was patient, steady, respectful, and careful with his reputation. In the early 1750s, George's life took a new turn. His half-brother Lawrence fell ill with tuberculosis, a wasting disease often fatal in that age. Seeking a cure, Lawrence traveled to the Caribbean island of Barbados in 1751, and George accompanied him. It was George's only trip abroad. The experience broadened his horizons. He saw sugar plantations, the brutal conditions of enslaved labor in the tropics, and the military fortifications of Britain's empire. The journey also left him with a lifelong scar. George contracted smallpox while in Barbados. Though he recovered, the illness left marks on his face, yet it also gave him immunity, a hidden blessing that would later serve him when smallpox ravaged soldiers during the Revolutionary War. Lawrence's health did not improve, and he died in 1752, leaving George with a stronger connection to Mount Vernon. though full ownership would come only later. The death marked another sorrow for the young man, but also drew him deeper into the life of responsibility and estate management. By the time George Washington turned 20, he was no longer merely a planter's son. He had measured miles of Virginia's frontier, earned respect as a professional surveyor, and experienced life beyond the colony's borders. He had learned resilience through family loss, developed immunity through illness, and entered circles of influence through the fair. He was, in every sense, a young man being tempered. His tools were no longer only compass and rod. His tools were discipline, patience, and vision. The horizon ahead was no longer simply fields and forests, but the gathering tensions between empires. Soon, Virginia's young surveyor would be called to serve in matters of war. The quiet world of surveying gave George Washington a grounding in patience and endurance, but the broader tides of empire soon called him beyond Virginia's rivers and farms. In the mid-18th century, the colonies of Britain and France stood on the edge of conflict, their ambitions colliding in the rich and contested region of the Ohio country. This land, a vast wilderness of forests, rivers, and native nations, was not an empty frontier but a vibrant space shaped by the alliances and sovereignties of indigenous peoples such as the Delaware, Shawnee, Iroquois, and Mingo. It was here, amid rival claims and delicate diplomacy, that Washington first stepped onto the stage of war. The Ohio River Valley was coveted by both empires. For the French, it was the connective artery between Canada and Louisiana, a way of linking their vast North American territories. For the British, particularly Virginians, it represented land for settlement and speculation, a frontier for expansion. The Ohio Company of Virginia, of which Washington's elder brother Lawrence had been a part, had secured a royal grant for lands in the region. These interests pushed Virginia leaders to assert claims, even as French troops built forts to protect their route south from Lake Erie. By 1753, tensions were high. The governor of Virginia, Robert Dinwiddie, determined to send a warning to the French to withdraw from the Ohio. He chose George Washington, just 21 years old, for the mission. Why such a young man? Partly because Washington had already proven himself responsible, disciplined, and familiar with frontier geography. He also had the patronage of the Fairfaxes, who recommended him. That winter, Washington set out through freezing forests with a small party, including the experienced frontiersman Christopher Geist. The journey was grueling. Icy rivers to ford, snow-covered trails, nights spent in the wilderness with frost settling heavily upon blankets. Washington delivered Dinwiddie's message at Fort Le Boeuf near present-day Waterford, Pennsylvania. The French commander, Jacques Legardeur de Saint-Pierre, received him politely but firmly refused to leave. Washington carried back the reply to Williamsburg. This mission, though diplomatically unsuccessful, was a triumph of endurance and reliability. Washington's published journal of the expedition gained him attention, both in Virginia and in London, where it was read as a sign of the colony's initiative and spirit. For the young Virginian, it was his first taste of international notice. The following year, matters turned violent. In the spring of 1754, Washington, now a lieutenant colonel of the Virginia militia, was sent with a small force to build a fort at the forks of the Ohio, the very site where Pittsburgh now stands. But the French had already arrived, constructing Fort Duquesne. Washington pushed forward, building a smaller fortification known as Fort Necessity in the Great Meadows. In May, his forces, alongside native allies led by the Seneca chief Tanacharison the Half-King, encountered a French detachment under Joseph Cowland de Jumonville. A skirmish ensued in the forest at dawn. The French commander was killed, though the exact sequence of events remains debated by historians. Whether Jumonville was killed in combat or executed afterward by native allies is uncertain. Washington's role was one of command, but not of intent for such an outcome. Still, the incident sparked a wider war. The French retaliated. In July, a larger force advanced on Fort Necessity. Washington's crude palisade, hastily built in a wet meadow, proved indefensible in heavy rain. Surrounded and outnumbered, his men exhausted, Washington accepted terms of surrender on July 3, 1754. He and his soldiers marched home in defeat, allowed to withdraw with honor. Yet hidden in the surrender document was language, poorly translated from French, that seemed to admit responsibility for an assassination of Johnville. Washington later insisted he had not understood the wording, but the incident left a stain in European eyes. This early defeat, however painful, was a teacher. Washington learned humility, the need for preparation, and the harsh reality of commanding men in the field. His military baptism had come not in glory but in mud, rain, and surrender. The conflict soon widened into what we now call the French and Indian War, part of the larger global 7 Years' War. In 1755, Britain dispatched General Edward Braddock with a large force to capture Fort Duquesne. Washington, though recovering from illness, joined as a volunteer aide. The expedition moved slowly through the wilderness, cutting a road as they advanced, an army of thousands threading through forests more accustomed to deer than drums. On July 9, 1755, near the Monongahela River, Braddock's column was ambushed by French soldiers and native warriors. In the confusion, disciplined European formations collapsed amid the trees. Braddock himself was mortally wounded. Washington, though ill and weakened, distinguished himself in the chaos. He rode back and forth across the field, rallying men, carrying orders, and helping organize the retreat. Accounts describe bullet holes tearing his coat and 2 horses shot beneath him, yet he remained unscathed. Some later told the story as if Providence itself shielded him. Whether by luck, skill, or destiny, Washington survived. The retreat was devastating. Nearly 2/3 of the force killed or wounded. Washington escorted the battered column back to Virginia, where grief and dismay swept the colony. Yet his personal reputation rose. The young provincial officer who had kept calm when British regulars faltered. After Braddock's defeat, Washington was given command of the Virginia Regiment. At just 23 years old, he was tasked with defending a frontier hundreds of miles long. Stretching through the Shenandoah Valley and into the Alleghenies, it was a grim duty, constructing forts, patrolling wilderness, responding to raids, and coping with shortages of men, money, and supplies. Settlers clamored for protection. The Assembly in Williamsburg argued over expenses, and Washington was left to mediate between unrealistic expectations and harsh realities. These years hardened him. He dealt with desertions, discipline, and the difficult balance between civilian authority and military necessity. He also developed a keen sense of the challenges of colonial defense, the lack of coordination among provinces, the slowness of British support, and the complexity of relations with native nations. It was, in many ways, a school for the frustrations he would later face on a larger stage during the Revolution. In 1758, Washington joined General John Forbes's expedition against Fort Duquesne. This time, the British advanced methodically, building a road and securing supply lines. As the army neared, the French abandoned and burned the fort. On its ruins rose Fort Pitt, a symbol of British control and the seat of the future city of Pittsburgh. With this campaign, Washington's active role in the French and Indian War drew to a close. He resigned his commission late in 1758. Frustrated at times by British officers who looked down on colonial troops, yet proud of the men he had led, he returned to civilian life, to Mount Vernon, and to a new chapter that would soon include marriage and estate management. These years of early campaigning left Washington with scars both literal and figurative. He had endured defeat at Fort Necessity, witnessed disaster under Braddock, and lived through the endless grind of frontier defense. He had also seen the courage of ordinary soldiers, the importance of supply and preparation, and the arrogance of distant authorities who misunderstood colonial realities. Most importantly, he carried from this period the knowledge that war was not glory alone. It was mud, hunger, and loss. It was sleepless nights, weary marches, and the sobering responsibility for other men's lives. This soberness would remain with him, tempering the idealism of younger patriots in the years ahead. George Washington had entered the Ohio forests as a young surveyor soldier of 21. He emerged, by 26, as a seasoned provincial commander, marked by both failure and resilience. He returned to Mount Vernon with no crown of victory, but with something deeper, an inner reserve, a quiet gravity, and the readiness for the roles destiny would soon unfold. The years of youthful campaigning had given George Washington experience, but they had also left him weary of soldiering under British command. By the close of 1758, having served through defeats, frustrations, and long campaigns, he resigned his commission and returned to the life of a Virginia planter in the quiet curves of the Potomac, among the fields and woodlands of Mount Vernon. He began to fashion the rhythms of a new chapter, one of estate, family, and domestic responsibility. Mount Vernon, once belonging to his half-brother Lawrence, had slowly become George's through inheritance and arrangement. By 1754, after Lawrence's death and the death of Lawrence's young daughter, George leased the property from his sister-in-law Anne Fairfax Washington. By 1761, following Anne's remarriage and relocation, George secured full ownership. It would be his lifelong home, the ground to which he always returned, the place where he would breathe his last. The estate was not grand in the European sense, but it was substantial. Its mansion overlooked the Potomac, a river highway that tied Virginia to wider worlds. Its land spread across fields where tobacco, wheat, and corn grew, where orchards bore fruit, and where enslaved laborers worked under compulsion. To manage Mount Vernon was to oversee not just crops but people, buildings, and the unending balance of accounts. Washington approached it as he approached surveying, with order, precision, and discipline. In January 1759, Washington's life changed profoundly. He married Martha Dandridge Custis, a widow of wealth and standing. Martha, born in 1731, was close in age to George. She had been married to Daniel Parke Custis, a wealthy planter, and upon his death in 1757 she inherited a considerable estate, including lands and enslaved people, as well as 2 young children, Jackie and Patsy. George and Martha married at her home, the White House plantation in New Kent County, Virginia, in what was by all accounts a warm and dignified ceremony. The union was one of both affection and advantage. George gained not only a partner of intelligence and steadiness, but also access to wealth that stabilized and expanded his social position. Martha found in George a reliable, responsible, and devoted husband, a man who would provide security and partnership. The marriage was, by contemporary accounts, a happy one. Though George and Martha never had children together, Washington took on the role of stepfather to Jackie and Patsy with seriousness. Letters suggest genuine warmth between George and the children, even if his discipline was steady and demanding. The absence of biological children may have been a private sorrow, but it also freed Washington in some respects, leaving him to devote himself to public life without concerns over direct heirs. As master of Mount Vernon, Washington devoted himself to agriculture. Initially, like most Virginia planters, he grew tobacco as the principal cash crop, but he grew disillusioned with its economic returns and the dependence it created on British markets. By the 1760s, he shifted increasingly toward wheat, which he could sell more directly, as well as corn, flax, and livestock. He was innovative in his methods. Washington experimented with crop rotation, fertilizers, and new tools. He built gristmills to process wheat and encouraged fishing in the Potomac as a source of both food and income. He kept meticulous records, filling ledgers with details of planting, harvesting, and outputs. Mount Vernon became not just a home but a model of diversified agriculture. But woven into this prosperity was the reality of slavery. Washington inherited enslaved workers from his family and acquired more through marriage to Martha. At Mount Vernon, the enslaved community grew to hundreds of men, women, and children, laboring in the fields, workshops, and households. Washington, like many of his contemporaries, accepted slavery as part of Virginia's economy, though over the years his views shifted. In his later life, he would wrestle with its moral and practical contradictions. Yet in these years of the 1760s and 1770s, the plantation was sustained by enslaved labor, and Washington's management of it was exacting. He was not known as unusually harsh, but he was demanding, attentive to discipline, and insistent on productivity. As a wealthy planter and husband to Martha Custis, Washington entered more firmly into the circle of Virginia's gentry. He attended church at Powhatan and Christchurch, rode to hounds and foxhunts, and entertained guests at Mount Vernon. He dressed with care, though without ostentation, favoring finely tailored but practical clothing. His presence was commanding, tall, broad-shouldered, and dignified, with a reserved manner that commanded respect. Washington also served in the House of Burgesses, Virginia's colonial assembly. Beginning in 1758, he was not a frequent orator. His temperament inclined more to listening than to fiery speech, but he was steady, respected, and increasingly involved in matters of public concern. His election to the House of Burgesses was partly a recognition of his service in the French and Indian War, partly his social position, and partly his reputation for responsibility. In these years, Washington also built connections with other planters and political figures. He developed friendships and alliances that would later matter greatly as the colonies moved toward conflict with Britain. Though not yet a revolutionary, he began to see firsthand the strains between imperial policy and colonial interests, particularly in matters of land, trade, and taxation. What emerges from accounts of Washington in this period is a man deeply conscious of his image and reputation. He was careful with money, though not immune to financial pressures. He was attentive to manners, though not prone to frivolity. He valued punctuality, order, and responsibility. He was also known for hospitality, receiving guests with dignity and warmth at Mount Vernon. His relationship with Martha seems to have been one of mutual respect and quiet affection. They were partners in estate management, co-hosts to visitors, and confidants in private life. Martha's presence added grace and stability to Washington's household, grounding him amid the responsibilities of land and public duty. By the late 1760s, Washington had settled into the role of planter, landowner, and burgess. Yet beneath the surface, currents of change stirred. British policies, including restrictions on Western settlement and new taxes to fund imperial debts, troubled colonial planters. Washington, with his investments in Western lands and his commitment to autonomy, felt the frustrations of imperial limits. His journals and correspondence reveal a man thinking about the wider world, about commerce, about the colony's place in the empire, about the opportunities and restrictions that defined life in Virginia. Though not yet a vocal leader in resistance, Washington was being prepared by circumstance for roles beyond the plantation. For now, though, he was a man at home by the river, walking the fields at dawn, reviewing accounts by candlelight, hosting friends in the evenings, and riding with hounds across open meadows. Mount Vernon was his anchor, Martha his companion, and the cycles of planting and harvest his daily measure. The quiet years at Mount Vernon, with their cycles of planting and harvest, their foxhounds and ledgers, were not untouched by the larger winds of empire. Beyond the Potomac's steady waters, a storm gathered across the Atlantic world. Britain, triumphant in the 7 Years' War, emerged with new territories but also deep debts. To secure its empire and to fund its burdens, Parliament turned to its colonies with fresh taxes and tighter controls. What began as policies of revenue became, in time, sparks of resistance. For George Washington, planter and burgess, these years were the bridge between private life and national destiny. One of the earliest measures to affect Washington personally was the Royal Proclamation of 1763, issued by King George III after the war. It forbade colonial settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains, reserving those lands for native nations and attempting to stabilize frontier relations. To many colonists, it seemed a practical measure. To Washington, it was an obstacle. He and other Virginia planters had invested in western lands, expecting settlement and profit. The proclamation cast doubt on these claims. Though not yet an open critic of the Crown, Washington felt the tension between imperial authority and colonial ambition. For a man who had marched through western forests and surveyed distant valleys, the restriction was more than ink on paper. It was the curtailing of vision. The financial burdens of empire soon pressed upon the colonies. In 1765, Parliament passed the Stamp Act, requiring that printed materials carry a purchased stamp. Newspapers, legal documents, even playing cards fell under the tax. For Virginians, it was not the expense alone but the principle. Taxation imposed without consent, without representation in Parliament. The Virginia House of Burgesses responded with words of protest. Younger members, like Patrick Henry, gave fiery speeches. Washington was not an orator, but he quietly supported the resistance. He recognized the danger of unchecked authority. To him, liberty was bound to property, and to be taxed without representation was to risk both. The Stamp Act crisis passed when Parliament repealed the measure in 1766, but it left scars of distrust. More acts followed. The Townshend duties of 1767, taxing imports like glass, paint, and tea. Washington, like many planters, began to shift his habits, boycotting British goods, encouraging local production, wearing homespun cloth in place of fine imports. His ledgers record careful attention to imports and exports, a planter increasingly conscious of political economy. At Mount Vernon, Washington lived as a man both local and global. His days were filled with estate management, correspondence, and hospitality. But his letters reveal an expanding horizon. He wrote to fellow planters about boycotts, about rights, about the unsettling arrogance of distant ministers. He did not yet call for independence, but he sensed a growing divergence between colony and crown. By the early 1770s, the colonies simmered. The Boston Massacre of 1770, in which British soldiers killed 5 colonists during a confrontation, deepened resentment. The Tea Act of 1773 and the ensuing Boston Tea Party sharpened the conflict. Parliament responded with the coercive acts called the Intolerable Acts in the colonies, closing Boston's port and restricting Massachusetts' governance. To Virginians, this was not a distant punishment, but a warning. If Parliament could close Boston, it could close any colonial port. Washington, though measured in speech, was resolute in principle. He expressed sympathy for Boston and argued that the colonies must stand together. His letters to friends in this period are filled with calm but firm language. That liberty once lost is lost forever. That a people must be vigilant against encroachments on their rights. In 1774, Virginia chose Washington as one of its delegates to the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia. He traveled north in autumn, joining figures who would become familiar to history: John Adams, Samuel Adams, Patrick Henry, Richard Henry Lee, and John Jay. The Congress did not yet speak of independence but sought to articulate colonial rights and to organize resistance. They agreed upon a Continental Association, calling for non-importation of British goods. Washington was not a man of many speeches in Congress, but his presence was noted. He wore his Virginia militia uniform, a subtle symbol of readiness. His quiet authority, his height and bearing, impressed his peers. He was not yet the commander they would later appoint, but he was already seen as a man of gravity, capable of shouldering responsibility. Events moved swiftly. In April 1775, at Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts, British troops and colonial militia clashed. What had been protest now became armed resistance. The sound of musket fire carried across the colonies, a signal that compromise was slipping away. When the Second Continental Congress convened in May 1775, Washington again was present. The Congress faced a dilemma: how to respond to escalating conflict while still professing loyalty to the Crown. In June, as the siege of Boston intensified, the Congress took a decisive step. It appointed George Washington as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. Why Washington? Several reasons converged. He had military experience, more than many colonial leaders. He was a Virginian, which helped unite North and South in the struggle. He was respected for his integrity, his calm under pressure, his willingness to sacrifice personal comfort for public duty, and he carried himself with a dignity that inspired trust. On June 16, 1775, Congress chose him unanimously. The next day he accepted, humbly but firmly, declaring that he did not feel equal to the command but would devote himself wholly to it. He refused a salary beyond expenses, signaling that this was a service, not a pursuit of wealth. Washington returned briefly to Mount Vernon before taking command. He knew he was leaving behind not only his estate but his beloved Martha, his stepchildren, his fields, and his quiet life by the Potomac. In letters, he admitted to the gravity of the task, the uncertainties ahead. He was not a man intoxicated by war. He was sobered by it. Martha Washington, though private by nature, would become his companion in duty. She joined him at winter encampments, sharing in the hardships of the army. But in the summer of 1775, as George rode north to Boston, she remained at Mount Vernon, entrusted with the estate and the care of family. Washington rode toward Cambridge, Massachusetts, where he would take command of a collection of militias now styled the Continental Army. They were undisciplined, undersupplied, and uncertain. Yet under his leadership, they would be forged into a force that endured. The man who had once paced fields with a surveyor's chain now stepped onto the broader field of history. The road from Mount Vernon to Cambridge was not merely a journey of miles, but of destiny. The surveyor had become the general. The planter had become the commander. The summer of 1775 brought George Washington from the quiet fields of Virginia to the tense encampments outside Boston. Their colonial militias had surrounded British troops following the clashes at Lexington and Concord. On July 3, 1775, beneath an ancient elm tree in Cambridge, Massachusetts, Washington formally took command of the Continental Army. He wore the simple blue and buff uniform of a Virginia officer, a visible reminder that this was no local quarrel but a united colonial effort. Washington faced daunting challenges. The army was a patchwork of militias, men of courage, yes, but lacking discipline, training, and supplies. Ammunition was scarce, weapons uneven, and enlistments uncertain. Washington moved quickly to impose order. He enforced drills, structured camps, and encouraged a sense of shared duty. His natural reserve gave him authority. He rarely raised his voice, but his presence commanded respect. In March 1776, after months of stalemate, Washington seized an opportunity. With cannon hauled overland from Fort Ticonderoga by Henry Knox, he fortified Dorchester Heights, overlooking Boston. The British found themselves suddenly vulnerable to bombardment. Rather than risk destruction, they evacuated the city on March 17, sailing to Halifax. It was Washington's first major success as commander, achieved not through battle but through persistence, preparation, and a bold stroke of positioning. Boston celebrated, but Washington remained sober. He knew the war had only begun. The British soon returned in force. In the summer of 1776, they targeted New York, a strategic port and center of commerce. Washington moved his army to defend it, but the odds were overwhelming. In August, at the Battle of Long Island, the British outflanked the Americans, forcing a retreat. Washington managed a daring withdrawal across the East River under cover of night and fog, a narrow escape that preserved the army. Through the fall, defeats followed: the loss of New York City, the retreat through New Jersey, and dwindling morale. By December, enlistments expired, Supplies dwindled, and the cause seemed near collapse. Yet Washington's resolve did not break. He saw that survival itself was victory. As long as the Continental Army endured, the Revolution lived. On Christmas night, 1776, Washington made a bold decision. In freezing weather, he led his men across the ice-choked Delaware River to surprise a Hessian garrison at Trenton, New Jersey. The march was brutal: sleet, snow, and bitter wind. Yet by dawn on December 26 they struck, overwhelming the surprised enemy. The victory was small in scale but immense in spirit. It revived hope, rallying the colonies at a moment of despair. A few days later, Washington fought again at Princeton, slipping away from the British pursuit and striking unexpectedly. These victories transformed the war's mood. Washington's personal courage, riding into danger to rally his men at Princeton, became legendary. The army had survived its darkest winter and emerged with renewed determination. The war dragged on. In 1777, Washington fought at Brandywine and Germantown, but the British captured Philadelphia, the revolutionary capital. Congress fled, morale faltered, and critics whispered of replacing Washington. Yet he held firm. In the winter of 1777 to 1778, the army encamped at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. Conditions were dire. Huts hastily built, men without shoes, supplies thin. Disease and hunger stalked the camp. Yet here, under suffering, the army was remade. The arrival of Baron Friedrich von Steuben, a Prussian officer, brought rigorous training. He drilled the men in discipline, maneuvers, and the essentials of modern warfare. Washington encouraged him, recognizing the need for professionalism. When spring came, the army marched out leaner, tougher, and more cohesive. At the Battle of Monmouth in June 1778, they fought the British in open field with new steadiness. Washington's leadership, his ability to hold the army together through hunger and doubt, was as important as any battlefield victory. A turning point came with the American alliance with France in 1778. After the American victory at Saratoga, France recognized the United States and entered the war against Britain. For Washington, this brought both hope and challenge. French ships and soldiers promised new strength, but coordination across languages, cultures, and ambitions was complex. Still, Washington welcomed the alliance, recognizing it as essential to ultimate victory. The war shifted south in its later years, with brutal campaigns in the Carolinas. Washington, though remaining with the main army in the north, followed developments closely. In 1781, a remarkable opportunity arose. The French fleet under Admiral de Grasse moved into the Chesapeake, cutting off British escape by sea. Washington, with French General Rochambeau, marched the Continental Army swiftly south to Virginia. At Yorktown, British General Cornwallis found himself trapped. Washington's troops by land, the French fleet by sea. The siege tightened through October. On October 19, 1781, Cornwallis surrendered his army. Though fighting would continue in scattered places, Yorktown effectively ended the war. For Washington it was vindication. Years of retreat, endurance, and sacrifice culminated in decisive victory. The once ragged militias of Cambridge had grown into a disciplined force, capable of defeating one of the world's great powers. The war formally ended with the Treaty of Paris in 1783. Washington, hailed as the hero of independence, made a decision that astonished the world. Rather than seize power, he resigned his commission to Congress at Annapolis on December 23, 1783. He spoke simply, thanking Providence and returning authority to the representatives of the people. It was a gesture rare in history, the victorious general laying down power voluntarily. Across the Atlantic, King George III is said to have remarked that if Washington truly did this, he would be the greatest man in the world. Washington returned to Mount Vernon, seeking the life of a farmer once more. Yet history was not finished with him. When George Washington returned to Mount Vernon in late 1783, he longed for peace. After nearly 9 years of war, He sought only the quiet rhythm of farming. He oversaw his fields, managed crop rotations, experimented with fertilizers, and rode his estate's boundaries at dawn. To those who visited, he seemed content, a man at last freed from the burdens of command. Yet beneath this outward calm, the new nation faced profound challenges, and history would call him again. The United States, independent in name, was bound under the Articles of Confederation, a system that left most power to the individual states and little to the central government. Congress could not levy taxes, it could not enforce laws, it could not regulate trade effectively. Soldiers went unpaid, debts mounted, and states quarreled over borders and commerce. Washington watched these struggles with concern. In letters, he warned that without unity, independence itself could unravel. His correspondence with figures like James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and Henry Knox reveals his growing unease. Washington, never eager for public strife, saw with clarity that the experiment for which so much had been sacrificed stood in peril. "We are either a united people," he wrote, "or we are not." In 1786, events in Massachusetts sharpened these fears. Farmers, burdened by debt and taxes, rose in protest under Daniel Shays, a former Continental Army officer. Armed groups closed courts and challenged state authority. Though the rebellion was suppressed, it alarmed leaders across the young republic. To Washington, it was a sign of fragility, of disorder born from weak governance. If states could not secure peace, what hope had the Union? These concerns led to the call for a constitutional convention in Philadelphia in 1787. Delegates from across the states gathered to revise the Articles of Confederation, but many suspected that only a new framework could hold the nation together. The delegates unanimously chose Washington as president of the convention. His presence was not for speeches, he rarely spoke during the debates, but for authority. His mere attendance signaled seriousness, unity, and trust. In the hall of the Pennsylvania State House, he sat at the front, his quiet dignity reminding all present that the sacrifices of war demanded wisdom and peace. The debates were fierce. Large states and small states, northern and southern interests, federal power and state sovereignty. Figures like Madison, Hamilton, Franklin, and Gouverneur Morris argued, compromised, and crafted. Washington did not shape the clauses directly, but his influence was immense. Delegates moderated their tone in his presence. They sought solutions rather than stalemates. His role was that of anchor, steady, impartial, guiding by example. In September 1787, the convention produced the United States Constitution, establishing a stronger federal government with executive, legislative, and judicial branches. When the document was signed, Washington's signature was the first, a mark of solemn endorsement. After ratification battles in the states, the new Constitution took effect in 1789. The question then arose, who would be president? To nearly all, the answer was obvious. Washington, the hero of independence, the man of integrity who had laid down power at Annapolis, was the natural choice. Yet Washington himself hesitated. He cherished Mount Vernon, and he feared the weight of expectations. "My movements to the chair of government will be accompanied by feelings not unlike those of a culprit," he confessed in a letter. Nevertheless, duty prevailed. In April 1789, Washington was unanimously elected the first president of the United States. He traveled from Mount Vernon to New York City, then the nation's capital, greeted by celebrations along the way. Farmers, merchants, and townsfolk lined the roads, cheering the man who embodied the revolution's ideals. On April 30, 1789, Washington stood on the balcony of Federal Hall in New York, placed his hand upon a Bible, and took the oath of office. The crowd below erupted in applause. His inaugural address was modest, acknowledging his own uncertainties and placing hope in Providence. There was no crown, no pomp of monarchy, only a man in plain dignity pledging to serve. Thus began a presidency unlike any the world had seen. Washington was not a king, yet he was more than a mere administrator. He was a precedent, a living symbol of what the Republic could be. Every decision he made would set an example. Washington faced the task of creating a government where none had existed. He established the executive departments, appointing men of talent. Thomas Jefferson as Secretary of State, Alexander Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury, Henry Knox as Secretary of War, and later Edmund Randolph as Attorney General. This became the cabinet, though the Constitution never explicitly named it. He signed into being the Judiciary Act of 1789, creating the federal court system. He approved the creation of the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, drafted largely by James Madison, ensuring protections of speech, religion, and due process. The new republic faced immediate tests. Hamilton's financial program, funding the national debt, assuming state debts, creating a national bank, stirred fierce debate. Jefferson and Madison opposed it, fearing centralized power. Washington, though cautious, supported Hamilton's vision, believing a strong financial foundation essential for survival. Foreign affairs posed equal strain. The French Revolution erupted in 1789, soon plunging Europe into war. American sympathies were divided. Some cheered France's struggle for liberty, others feared its violence. Washington, recognizing the young nation's fragility, declared neutrality in 1793, determined to keep America out of entangling conflicts. At home, resistance flared. In western Pennsylvania, farmers protested a federal excise tax on whiskey, sparking the Whiskey Rebellion of 1794. Washington responded firmly. He personally led troops partway into the field, the only sitting president to command in person. The show of force dispersed the rebellion without battle, proving that the new government had both authority and restraint. Washington served 2 terms, unanimously re-elected in 1792, but by the late 1790s he longed for retirement. The burdens of office, the rise of political factions, and the endless scrutiny weighed heavily. In 1796, he announced he would not seek a 3rd term. His farewell address, written with the help of Hamilton, warned against political parties, sectionalism, and foreign entanglements. It was both counsel and legacy, a message to a young republic still fragile. When he left office in March 1797, he once more did what few leaders in history had done. He stepped down willingly. The peaceful transfer of power from Washington to John Adams confirmed that the presidency was an office of service, not possession. At last, Washington returned home. He was 65, ready to live out his days as a farmer. He walked his fields, oversaw his fisheries, corresponded with friends, and enjoyed evenings with Martha. Mount Vernon, which had waited for him through war and government, was once more his refuge. Yet the nation he left was stronger than the one he had taken charge of. A republic standing on firmer ground, guided by the example of a president who placed country above self. When George Washington returned to Mount Vernon in 1797, he was 65 years old. He had lived a life of ceaseless duty, soldier, commander, president, and now, at last, he longed for the rhythms of private existence. The Potomac shimmered as it had in his youth, the seasons turned, and the estate welcomed him as its master once again. For 2 years, Washington savored the life of a farmer, yet even in retirement, the affairs of the young republic brushed against his door. Washington devoted himself to agriculture with the same discipline he had given to war and politics. Mount Vernon, by this time, had expanded into 5 separate farms, each managed with rotation of crops and careful attention. He experimented with fertilizers, plowing methods, and the use of manure to replenish the soil. Wheat, corn, flax, and vegetables grew under his direction. He oversaw orchards and vineyards, built a distillery that became one of the largest in America, and maintained fisheries along the Potomac that yielded hundreds of thousands of herring and shad. Every detail mattered to him. His ledgers record the number of barrels of flour ground, the count of fish caught, the hours of work performed. To Washington, farming was both science and art, a way to sustain life, to steward the earth, and to provide for community. He often said he took greater satisfaction in being considered a farmer than in any other title. Martha Washington shared these years with him in quiet companionship. Together, they entertained a steady stream of visitors, neighbors, travelers, admirers from abroad. Mount Vernon was never empty of guests. People came to see the man who had led armies and presided over a republic, and they were met with the hospitality of a gentleman farmer. Washington was gracious, though never overly warm with strangers. He maintained his reserve, yet his presence was gentle, calming, and dignified. Evenings often passed with simple pleasures, conversation by candlelight, walks on the piazza overlooking the river, or letters written at his desk. Washington's correspondence during these years is filled with reflections on farming, on national affairs, and on the passage of time. He sought peace, yet the world beyond Mount Vernon remained restless. Though retired, Washington could not fully escape public life. Political tensions in the young nation deepened between the Federalists, led by Alexander Hamilton and John Adams, and the Democratic Republicans led by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. Washington, weary of faction, worried that parties would divide the country. In 1798, as tensions with France threatened war, President John Adams turned again to Washington. France, angered by American neutrality and by treaties with Britain, had seized American ships at sea. War seemed imminent, and Congress authorized the raising of a provisional army. Washington, despite his age, was named commander-in-chief once more. He accepted, reluctantly. Though he did not expect to take the field, he lent his name and guidance to the organization of forces. He appointed Hamilton as Inspector General, ensuring that leadership would be in capable hands. Fortunately, open war never came. Diplomacy eased the crisis. Yet the episode showed that even in retirement, Washington's presence remained the Republic's anchor. By late 1799, Washington was still vigorous for his age. He rode daily across his lands, inspecting work, speaking with overseers, noting the condition of fences and fields. On December 12th, he spent several hours outdoors in cold, wet weather, marking trees and supervising. He returned home with a sore throat but gave it little thought. The next day, despite worsening weather, he again rode out to inspect his estate. By evening, he was hoarse and chilled. On December 14th, his illness grew severe. Doctors were summoned, but the medicine of the age was limited. They applied repeated bloodletting, believing it a cure for fever and inflammation. Washington endured the treatments calmly, even as his strength ebbed. He was fully conscious of his condition, and in his final hours, he expressed concern only that his affairs be in order and that his burial be delayed until certain of his passing. That night, around 10 o'clock, George Washington died at Mount Vernon. He was 67 years old. Martha, grieving yet composed, is said to have whispered, "'Tis well, all is now over. I shall soon follow him." News of his death spread swiftly. Across the young United States, bells tolled. Citizens gathered in mourning, and orators spoke of loss. Henry Lee, delivering a eulogy in Congress, declared Washington to be first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen. The phrase became the enduring epitaph of his character. Foreign nations also paused. In Britain, once his adversary, newspapers expressed respect. In France, Napoleon ordered mourning ceremonies for the fallen general of liberty. Washington's death was not merely the passing of a man, it was the closing of a chapter of history, the departure of a figure who had embodied Republican virtue. Washington was buried at Mount Vernon on December 18, 1799. His coffin was placed in the family vault on the estate, overlooking the Potomac. Simple, solemn, and close to the land he loved, the burial reflected his own wishes. Over time, Mount Vernon became a place of pilgrimage, visited by citizens and leaders alike. It remains so to this day, a quiet reminder of the man who sought only to return home, and who found in death the peace he long desired. In his last years, Washington had known both rest and duty. He had walked his fields as a farmer, hosted friends as a gentleman, and once more borne the title of commander. He had lived to see his country secure, though still fragile, and had entrusted it to younger hands. His passing left a void, but also a legacy, the example of a leader who placed service above ambition, humility above power, and the common good above self. When George Washington died in December 1799, the nation he had guided for so long was still young, scarcely more than a fragile experiment. Yet his life and death immediately took on a meaning far larger than any single person. He was remembered not only as a general or a president, but as the living embodiment of the new republic's ideals. The story of Washington became inseparable from the story of America itself. The weeks following his death were filled with public grief. Churches held solemn services, towns draped black crepe across their halls, and citizens gathered in silence. In Philadelphia, Congress adjourned to mark his passing, and Henry Lee's eulogy proclaimed him first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen. Those words captured the essence of Washington's place in the public mind, a man of duty who had given his strength to both war and peace. The mourning was not confined to America. In Britain, where Washington had once been branded a rebel, newspapers honored his character, acknowledging that even in opposition he had embodied dignity and restraint. In France, Napoleon Bonaparte ordered tributes, recognizing Washington as a figure of liberty on the world stage. His passing seemed to close an era, to seal the revolution into history with solemnity. From the very beginning, Washington's life was seen as a model of republican virtue. He had led armies to victory yet refused to seize power. He had served as president yet stepped down willingly after 2 terms. In an age when many revolutions collapsed into tyranny or dictatorship, Washington's restraint was extraordinary. To Americans, he proved that power could be held in trust and surrendered for the common good. This legacy shaped the presidency itself. Every custom, from the inaugural oath to the cabinet system, from the 2-term precedent to the title of Mr. President, carried Washington's imprint. His dignity without pomp, his authority without arrogance, his firmness without cruelty became the silent constitution of the office. Future presidents measured themselves against the standard he set. As decades passed, Washington's image entered the realm of memory and myth. Stories multiplied, some true, others embellished. Parson Mason Weems, in his popular biography published in 1800, gave the world the tale of the young George who confessed, "I cannot tell a lie," after cutting down a cherry tree. Though false, the story became a symbol of honesty, teaching generations of children that Washington embodied truth. Artists and sculptors cast him in marble and on canvas. A Roman general in uniform, a statesman in plain black suit, a farmer surveying his fields. He became not merely a man of history but a cultural figure, a touchstone for ideals of courage, humility, and patriotism. When the new federal capital was laid out along the Potomac, it was named Washington, D.C., in his honor. Streets, counties, towns, and schools across the nation soon bore his name. Later in the 19th century, the Washington Monument was erected, a towering obelisk rising from the National Mall, visible for miles, pointing upward like the aspirations of the Republic itself. Each act of remembrance carried both gratitude and symbolism. Washington was not merely remembered as a person but revered as the embodiment of national identity. His image was printed on currency, carved into stone, and placed at the heart of civic ritual. Yet behind the monuments and myths was also the complexity of a human life. Washington was reserved in temperament, cautious in speech, and sometimes difficult to know. He was ambitious for honor yet wary of glory. He managed an estate that relied on enslaved labor, a reality that later generations have wrestled with, even as they honored his role in securing liberty. In his will, he took a step rare for his time. He ordered the emancipation of the enslaved people he directly owned, though the majority, those brought by Martha's Custis estate, remained bound. It was a gesture of conscience, signaling an awareness of the contradictions he carried. Modern historians remind us that Washington's greatness lay not in perfection, but in restraint and growth. He learned from failure, endured hardship, and balanced ambition with humility. His strength was not in always knowing the answer, but in always choosing responsibility. Across 2 centuries, Washington's figure has endured. In times of national crisis, Americans have looked back to his example. The patience at Valley Forge, the humility at Annapolis, the steadiness of the presidency. He remains a figure not of passion but of calm, not of flamboyance but of principle. Even in the 21st century, visitors walk the halls of Mount Vernon, stand before his tomb, and sense in the quiet air the presence of a life both ordinary and extraordinary. Washington never sought to be king, nor prophet, nor myth. He sought only to serve as best he could, and in that very simplicity, he became immortal. George Washington's life cannot be understood apart from the age in which he lived. He was born into a colonial world tied to the rhythms of empire, raised in a society of planters and merchants bound to Britain, and came of age in an era shaped by the ideas of the Enlightenment. The 18th century was a time of questioning authority, of celebrating reason, of envisioning liberty as a universal aspiration. Washington, though not a philosopher in the mold of Jefferson or Madison, absorbed these currents through practice more than prose. Central to Enlightenment thought was the belief in rational order, in self-discipline, and in civic virtue. Washington embodied these ideals not by writing treatises but by living them. His self-control, his attention to order, his refusal to seize power. These were Enlightenment values translated into action. He believed that a republic required not only laws but also leaders of character, men who placed duty above self. In his person, he showed that character itself was a form of governance. Yet the world of Washington was also one of contradictions. Liberty and slavery coexisted uneasily. The ideals of independence were proclaimed even as indigenous peoples were displaced, and enslaved Africans toiled in bondage. Washington's own estate rested upon this paradox. He recognized the wrong, at least in part, and in his final will provided for the emancipation of those he personally owned. But the broader institution remained, a stain upon the nation's birth. Washington's life reminds us that history is never without complexity. He was a man of his time, and yet in key ways he looked beyond it. His restraint in power, his willingness to step down, his recognition that leadership is service, these remain timeless. Washington's story was not only American but global. Monarchs and ministers across Europe watched the American experiment with curiosity and skepticism. Would a republic survive without a king? Would liberty dissolve into chaos? Washington's conduct answered a republic could endure if guided by discipline and virtue. His voluntary resignation of power, first at Annapolis, later at the presidency, astonished the world. It became a model for republican governance not just in America but in movements abroad. In his own lifetime, Washington became the symbol that bound together diverse colonies and peoples. New England farmers, Southern planters, frontier settlers, and city merchants all saw in him a leader who transcended regional quarrels. He was not eloquent in speech, but his silence carried weight. He was not brilliant in strategy, but his perseverance achieved victory. He was not flamboyant in politics, but his steadiness gave shape to the presidency. In all this he was the symbol of unity, the indispensable man, as later historians have called him. Centuries have passed since Washington walked the fields of Mount Vernon, yet his presence lingers. Children still learn of him as the nation's first president, the general who crossed the Delaware, the man of honesty and virtue. Historians continue to study his letters, weighing his strengths and flaws. Citizens still visit his home, walking the same piazza where he once gazed across the river at sunset. Time softens the edges of history, turning men into monuments, lives into lessons. But to remember Washington fully is to see both the marble and the man, the boy of modest education who taught himself order, the young officer who learned through failure, the planter who cared for soil and field, the leader who carried a fragile republic through its first uncertain years. What remains most striking is not his victories but his humility. Washington could have been king, yet he refused. He could have held power for life, yet he stepped aside. He could have sought personal glory, yet he placed the republic above himself. His greatness lay in restraint, in the rare wisdom that the truest strength is not in seizing power but in letting it go. In this, Washington became not just the father of his country, but a figure of enduring calm. His life whispers that leadership need not be loud, that virtue can dwell in silence, that dignity can be steady rather than dazzling. As night gathers and the stars return to their courses, we look back upon the life of George Washington, farmer, surveyor, soldier, president, and, above all, servant of the Republic. He lived not for himself but for the future. His story is not a tale of conquest but of character, not of ambition but of balance, not of domination but of service. And so, across centuries, his memory remains like the quiet current of the Potomac, flowing steadily, reflecting both the sunlight of history and the shadows of complexity. To remember Washington is to rest in the assurance that even in turbulent times, dignity and virtue can guide the way.